The piercing wail of sirens cut through Atlanta's thick summer air, echoing between glass buildings and tree-lined streets. The city was alive with its usual noise, cars rushing past, pedestrians glued to their phones, indifferent to the flashing red and white lights that blurred past them. But inside the speeding ambulance, time had slowed to a crawl. Derrick Coleman worked with sharp focus, his dark brown eyes locked on the small, fragile body sprawled on the stretcher. The boy could not have been older than 8. His face was swollen, his lips tinged a dangerous shade of blue, and his chest rose with shallow, desperate gasps. The boy's wheezing was faint, like a whisper fading in and out. BP's dropping, 80/50, Derrick muttered, his voice calm despite the urgency. His partner, Jake Harris, a stocky white man with a steady hand on the wheel, glanced in the rearview mirror. "We're 2 minutes out." Derrick nodded, his mind racing faster than the sirens outside. "He's in anaphylactic shock. Severe. We can't wait." Derrick's hands moved quickly, checking the 4-line, adjusting the oxygen mask, and preparing a syringe filled with epinephrine. His fingers were steady, but his jaw clenched slightly. He had done this countless times. But it never got easier when a child's life was slipping away. The ambulance screeched around a corner, tires squealing as they sped toward Brookhaven Heights, an upscale neighborhood nestled behind iron gates and neatly trimmed hedges. The kind of neighborhood where mansions sat like silent judges, their stone facades hiding lives of luxury and privilege. As the ambulance pulled into a wide, circular driveway paved with gray cobblestones, Derrick jumped out, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and wealth. A man in an expensive tailored suit sprinted down the marble steps of the sprawling White House. His tie flapped loosely around his neck, his face flushed with panic. "That's my son. What happened to him?" the man shouted, his voice sharp, not with concern alone, but with authority. "We're stabilizing him, sir. Please step back," Derrick replied, his tone professional but firm. He and Jake worked in sync, lowering the stretcher and checking the boy's vitals. But the man's eyes locked onto Derrick's face, lingering there just a second too long. His gaze darkened, narrowing with something beyond fear, disbelief. "Are you even qualified for this? Get your hands off my son," the man snapped, stepping forward aggressively. Jake instinctively moved between them, his palm outstretched. "Sir, you need to step back. Let us do our job." But Derrick did not flinch. He had seen that look before, the one that questioned not his competence but his existence, the one that said, "You don't belong here." Without missing a beat, Derrick leaned over the boy, his hands steady as he administered the injection. He counted under his breath, watching for signs of improvement. Seconds later, the boy's breathing began to ease, his chest rising more evenly, though his face remained pale. His airways opening. "We've got him stabilized," Derrick muttered, more to himself than anyone else. They rushed the boy into the ambulance, leaving the man standing in the driveway, his face twisted with something ugly, something that had nothing to do with fear for his child. At the hospital, the ER team took over. Doctors confirmed what Derrick already knew. The boy would have died without the immediate intervention. Derrick stood quietly near the doorway as the boy's mother arrived, tears streaming down her face. She thanked the doctors profusely, hugging nurses and shaking hands with the ER physician. But her eyes never met Derrick's. And Thomas Caldwell, the boy's father, did not say a word. He glanced at Derrick briefly, his lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, then turned away as if Derrick were invisible. The next morning, Derrick was called into the EMS office. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he sat across from Captain Linda Rhodes, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach. She slid a thin folder across her cluttered desk. "It's a formal complaint," she said, her voice low. Derrick's brows furrowed as he opened the folder. The words blurred for a moment before they sharpened into something unmistakable. An accusation of unprofessional conduct and reckless handling during the emergency response. The name at the top of the page, Thomas Caldwell. Derrick looked up, his jaw tightening. "I saved his son's life." Captain Rhodes sighed, folding her hands on the desk. "I know, but Thomas Caldwell isn't just any parent. He's influential. wealthy, connected. The department has to investigate. Derrick stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor. His years of service, his spotless record, and the lives he had saved. It all meant nothing in the face of one man's prejudice. As he walked out of the office, the familiar sounds of the MS station felt distant, muffled by a truth he had known all his life but hoped he could outrun. This was not about what he had done. It was about who he was. And this was just the beginning. The days following the complaint weighed on Derrick Coleman like an invisible force pressing against his chest. He had faced emergencies where seconds decided between life and death, but this felt different. This was not about saving a life. It was about defending his own name, his integrity, and the very foundation of his career. The internal investigation began swiftly. Derrick found himself sitting in sterile rooms under harsh fluorescent lights, facing panels of people who asked the same questions with slight variations, as if rephrasing them could somehow trap him in a lie. Did you follow proper protocol during the emergency response? Could your judgment have been impaired due to the high-stress environment? Were you at any point aggressive or confrontational with the patient's father? Derrick answered each question calmly, his voice steady even when frustration bubbled beneath the surface. He knew what they were really asking. Can we find a flaw to justify this complaint? Despite his professionalism, doubt crept in, not about his actions, but about the system itself. At the EMS station, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations grew quieter when he walked into the room. Colleagues who once greeted him with easy smiles now offered stiff nods or avoided eye contact altogether. The station walls, once filled with familiar faces and casual camaraderie, felt colder, as if the very air had changed. Even Jake Harris, his partner, seemed unsure of what to say. One afternoon, as they restocked the ambulance after a routine call, Jake finally broke the silence. "You know I've got your back, right?" Jake's voice was low, almost hesitant. Derrick closed the supply cabinet and turned to face him. "Do you?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Derrick's gaze. "I mean, yeah. It's just, people are talking. Saying maybe you were too." He stopped himself mid-sentence, realizing the weight of his words. "Too what, Jake?" Derrick's tone was sharp but controlled. "Too confident? Too black?" Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's not what I meant." "But it's what you were about to say," Derrick replied, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "You do not have to say it out loud. I hear it in the silence." Jake had no response. At home, Derrick found little solace. His modest apartment, usually a place of peace after long shifts, felt suffocating. He avoided the news, but it was impossible to escape. His face appeared on local broadcasts, framed by sensational headlines. Prominent businessman files complaint against Paramedic, questions professional conduct. The story had been twisted into something unrecognizable, painting Derrick not as a hero, but as a problem. His mother, Evelyn Coleman, called often from Chicago. Her voice was a mix of warmth and worry, layered with the wisdom of someone who had fought battles of her own. "They can try to twist the story, but they can't change the truth," she said during one call. "You come from people who never had the luxury of silence. Hold your ground, baby." Her words were comforting, but they did not ease the weight on Derrick's chest. The turning point came one evening as Derrick sat in a small diner near the station, picking at a plate of cold fries. The television mounted in the corner played another segment about his case. His name flashed across the screen, his image framed by doubt. "You're Derrick Coleman, right?" The voice pulled him from his thoughts. A woman stood beside his table, dressed in a tailored navy suit. Her sharp features softened slightly when their eyes met. "I'm Emily Caldwell," she said, sliding into the booth without waiting for permission. "Thomas Caldwell's sister." Derrick's body tensed instinctively. "What do you want?" Emily's gaze was steady. "I'm here because I believe you." Derrick let out a short, bitter laugh. "You believe me? That is new." She did not flinch. "I know my brother. This is not the first time he's used his influence to get what he wants, but it's the first time someone's fighting back." Derrick studied her face, searching for hidden motives, but all he saw was conviction. "My nephew is alive because of you," Emily continued. But my brother cannot see past his own ignorance. He has always been like this, hiding his prejudice behind charm and money. I have ignored it for years. I am done ignoring it. Derrick's skepticism softened slightly. So, what now? You want to clear your conscience? Emily leaned forward, her voice firm. I want to help you expose the truth. Their unlikely alliance began that night. Emily had access to information Derrick could never reach. Emails, internal communications, and legal channels that could unravel the web Thomas had spun. They met regularly in quiet spaces, Emily's office, empty conference rooms, even Derrick's small apartment filled with stacks of paperwork and notes. They reviewed hospital records, eyewitness accounts, and security footage. This email shows Thomas contacted the hospital's board members the same day as the incident, Emily pointed out, scrolling through her laptop. He demanded disciplinary action before an investigation even started. Derrick clenched his jaw, reading the cold, calculated words. Phrases like concerns about professionalism and potential liability were thinly veiled attempts to disguise prejudice as protocol. Emily also uncovered hospital security footage. The grainy video showed Derrick working calmly, saving her nephew's life while Thomas raged in the background. This is it, Emily whispered. This proves everything. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. One evening, Derrick returned to his car after a late shift. His tires were slashed, and a note was tucked under the windshield wiper. Know your place. Emily faced her own backlash. Her family distanced themselves, accusing her of betraying them. During one tense phone call, her father's voice was cold and distant. You are choosing a stranger over your own blood, he said. I am choosing what is right, Emily replied before hanging up. Despite the threats, they continued. Their partnership grew stronger, built not on friendship but on shared purpose. This isn't just about me, Derrick said during one late-night meeting. It's about every person who has been told they don't belong. Every voice that's been silenced. Emily nodded, her voice quiet but firm. Then let's make sure they hear us. The partnership between Derrick Coleman and Emily Caldwell was forged in necessity, strengthened by a shared goal, and tested by the walls built around them. Their fight was no longer just about clearing Derrick's name. It had become about exposing a system that thrived on silence, fear, and power. Emily's office became their war room. It was a modest space tucked inside a small law firm known more for corporate cases than civil rights battles. Papers were scattered across her desk, emails, official reports, hospital records, all of them threads in the web of deceit spun by Thomas Caldwell. Derrick sat across from her, his expression tense but focused. His uniform felt heavier these days, like it carried not just his duties as a paramedic, but also the invisible weight of every accusation, every doubter, every unspoken bias. Emily pointed at her laptop screen. These emails between my brother and the hospital administrators are key. He pressured them into filing additional complaints against you. Look at the timestamps, before the internal investigation even started. Derrick leaned in, reading the lines carefully. The language was coded, filled with phrases like concerns about public image and potential liability issues. None of it directly accused him of wrongdoing, but the subtext was clear. They were setting him up. He's not just trying to discredit me, Derrick said quietly. He's trying to erase me. Emily nodded. People like Thomas do not just want to win. They want to make sure you are never in a position to challenge them again. Their late nights grew longer as they built their case. Emily reached out to contacts in the legal community, including a nurse named Maria Gonzalez who had been on duty the day Derrick saved Thomas's son. Maria agreed to meet them at a small cafe outside the hospital. I remember everything, Maria said, her voice steady. You were calm, professional. The boy was in critical condition, and you saved his life. I saw Mr. Caldwell yelling at you while you were working, but you never even flinched. Maria's statement was more than just words. It was a piece of the puzzle they needed. But as they gathered evidence, the backlash grew louder. Derrick's car was vandalized again, this time with a message spray-painted across the side. You don't belong. Emily faced threats, too. Anonymous emails filled her inbox, some warning her to stay in her lane, others more explicit in their hatred. One evening, after reviewing documents late into the night, Emily leaned back in her chair, her face shadowed with exhaustion. I knew my family had issues, she admitted, her voice soft, but I never realized how deep it ran until now. I spent years pretending it wasn't my problem because I wasn't the one being hurt. I was wrong. Derrick looked at her, seeing not just an ally but someone wrestling with the truth of her own privilege. It's easy to ignore when it's not your fight, Derrick replied quietly. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. They knew the hearing would not just be about facts. It would be about perception, power, and the ability to stand firm under pressure. Emily prepared Derrick for the aggressive questioning he would face. They rehearsed responses, anticipating every tactic Thomas's legal team might use to twist his words. They'll try to make you angry, Emily warned. They'll push you to react so they can say, "See? He's unstable." Derrick nodded. Then I won't give them that satisfaction. The day before the hearing, Derrick visited his mother. Evelyn Coleman opened the door with a warm smile, pulling him into a tight hug. They can try to shake you, but they can't break you, she whispered. Her words stayed with him as he stood in front of the mirror that night, staring at his reflection. He saw not just a paramedic fighting for his career, but a man standing in the shadow of generations who had fought before him. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself carried the weight of what was about to unfold. The municipal building in downtown Atlanta stood tall and imposing, its glass windows reflecting the faces of those gathered outside. Reporters clustered near the entrance, their microphones and cameras aimed at anyone who looked like they had something to say. Derrick Coleman arrived early, dressed in his neatly pressed paramedic uniform. The badge on his chest gleamed under the muted light, a symbol of service now shadowed by false accusations. But Derrick's posture was steady, his face calm. He had faced life-and-death situations before. This was just another kind of battle. Emily Caldwell met him at the steps, holding a slim folder packed with documents. She wore a tailored black suit, her hair pulled back, her expression sharp with determination. "You ready?" she asked. Derrick nodded. "I've been ready." Inside the hearing room, the tension was thick. Rows of seats were filled with paramedics, city officials, reporters, and curious onlookers. At the front sat the review board, a panel of 5 individuals tasked with determining Derrick's fate. Across the room sat Thomas Caldwell, flanked by his legal team. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his face the picture of calm confidence. He glanced at Derrick briefly, offering a smirk that spoke of arrogance and entitlement. The hearing began with procedural formalities before Gerard Simmons, the lead investigator, addressed the room. This hearing will determine whether paramedic Derrick Coleman acted with professional misconduct during the emergency response involving the Caldwell family. Thomas Caldwell was the first to speak. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie before stepping to the podium. His voice was smooth, polished, every word dripping with feigned concern. "My son nearly died," Thomas began, his tone grave. "And while I am grateful he survived, I cannot ignore the reckless behavior displayed by Mr. Coleman. His unprofessionalism put my child at risk, and no parent should have to wonder if their emergency responders are competent enough to save their child's life." A murmur rippled through the audience. Derrick remained still, his jaw clenched, refusing to let anger show. When it was Derrick's turn, he stood and approached the podium. The room grew quiet, all eyes on him. "I am not here to defend my qualifications," Derrick began, his voice steady and clear. "My record speaks for itself. I am here because on the day in question, I did my job. I saved a child's life. The accusations against me are not about my actions. They are about the assumptions made because of who I am." He let the words hang in the air, allowing their weight to settle over the room. This is not just about a complaint. It's about the reality that some people will question your competence not because of what you've done, but because of what you look like. Emily rose next, presenting the evidence they had painstakingly gathered. She played the hospital security footage on a large screen at the front of the room. The grainy video showed Derrick working quickly and efficiently, administering life-saving treatment, while Thomas Caldwell shouted angrily in the background. The audio captured Thomas's voice clearly. "Get your hands off my son." The room grew tense, the ugly truth laid bare for everyone to see. Emily continued, her voice steady as she presented the emails. Messages from Thomas to hospital administrators and city officials, demanding Derrick's suspension before any investigation had begun. This was not a concerned parent seeking justice, Emily said, her gaze fixed on the review board. This was a powerful man using his influence to destroy someone's career based on prejudice. Thomas Caldwell's attorney objected, claiming character assassination, but the evidence was undeniable. Then Maria Gonzalez, the nurse who had witnessed the incident, was called to testify. Derrick Coleman was professional, calm, and did everything right, Maria said firmly. If he hadn't acted as quickly as he did, that little boy wouldn't be here today. Thomas Caldwell's composure finally cracked. He stood abruptly, pointing a finger at Derrick. "This is a witch hunt against me," he shouted, his face flushed with anger. "She's my sister, for God's sake. Of course she's going to take his side." Emily stood without hesitation. "I'm not here because I'm your sister. I'm here because you're wrong." The room fell into stunned silence. After hours of testimonies, evidence, and tense exchanges, the review board retreated to deliberate. The wait felt endless, the clock ticking loudly in the quiet room. When the board returned, Gerard Simmons cleared his throat before speaking. "After reviewing all evidence and testimonies, we find no grounds to support the claims against paramedic Derrick Coleman. The complaint is dismissed." The gavel struck, but the real verdict had been delivered long before. Derrick exhaled deeply, the tension finally breaking. Emily reached over, squeezing his shoulder gently. "You did it," she whispered. Derrick nodded, his voice low but resolute. "No, we did it." The weeks following the hearing felt different, though the city of Atlanta carried on as if nothing had changed. Cars still honked impatiently in traffic, sirens still wailed in the distance, and people hurried past one another, heads down, lives moving forward. But for Derrick Coleman, everything was different. He returned to work, dressed in the same uniform, the same MS badge stitched over his heart, but the weight it carried had shifted. His name had been cleared, his competence validated. Yet a part of him knew this was not the end of the fight. The hearing had exposed more than one man's prejudice. It had pulled back the curtain on a system that allowed that prejudice to thrive in silence. At the EMS station, the atmosphere was tense but quieter in its judgment. Some colleagues greeted him with nods, while others avoided eye contact. The same people who once joked with him in the break room now kept their distance, unsure whether to congratulate him or pretend nothing had happened. Jake Harris, his partner, stood near the ambulance, fidgeting with the straps on a medical bag. His usual easy confidence was gone, replaced by hesitation. Jake cleared his throat. "Hey, Derrick, good to have you back." Derrick studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. He gave a small nod. "Thanks." The words hung in the air, simple, but enough. Derrick knew Jake's discomfort was not just guilt. It was the realization that silence had its own consequences. The department announced new policies not long after. There were mandatory bias training sessions, new protocols for handling complaints, and public statements about accountability. But Derrick knew change was more than a checklist. It was in the conversations people avoided, the truths they were afraid to face. One afternoon, Captain Linda Rhodes approached Derrick in the supply room. "I've seen a lot in this job," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "But watching you stand up there, holding your ground, that's something I won't forget." Derrick met her eyes, the respect mutual. "It shouldn't have taken all that to be heard." She nodded slowly. "No, it shouldn't have." Despite the department's attempts to move forward, Derrick felt the shadows of what had happened trailing behind him. It was not bitterness, just the knowledge that even when you win, the scars remain. Weeks later, Derrick found an envelope slipped under his apartment door. Inside was a handwritten letter from Emily Caldwell. "Dear Derrick, I've spent most of my life standing in rooms where my voice was heard because of my last name. But it wasn't until I stood beside you that I understood what it meant to fight for something real. Thank you for not backing down, even when the world gave you every reason to. You saved my nephew's life, but you also saved me from the comfort of my own silence. I'll never forget that. With gratitude, Emily." Derrick folded the letter carefully, his heart heavy but full. A few days later, as he loaded equipment into the ambulance after a call, a small voice caught his attention. "Hey, mister." Turning around, Derrick saw Thomas Caldwell's son, healthy and full of energy, standing beside his mother near the parking lot. The boy ran up to Derrick with a bright smile. "My mom says you're a hero," the boy said, his grin wide and sincere. Derrick crouched down to meet the boy's gaze, his heart swelling with something deeper than pride. "I just did my job," Derrick replied softly. The boy shrugged. "Sounds like a hero to me." As the boy ran back to his mother, Derrick stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. It was a simple interaction, but it carried more weight than any courtroom verdict. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered against the night sky, Derrick sat quietly, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the countless people who had fought battles like his, whose names were never cleared, whose voices were never heard. He thought about Emily, about Maria Gonzalez, about every person who chose to speak when it was easier to stay silent. And he realized something important. Justice was not always a loud victory. Sometimes it was found in the quiet, the truth spoken out loud, the courage to stand even when you stood alone, and the small voices that echoed long after the noise faded. Derrick had not just saved a life. He had claimed his own voice, and it had been heard.